Welcome to Across Africa. Today we're talking colonialism. The political control and settlement of African nations by European ones in the late 19th century has profoundly shaped Africa's development, including its borders. Many of the continent's 54 nations had frontiers imposed upon them after representatives of 14 European countries met at the 1884 Berlin Conference to divvy up the continent. By 1914, 90% of Africa had been divided between 7 European powers bent on fueling their industrial revolution with the continent's resources. Well, Dr. Catherine Nwajiaku Dahu will be joining me for today's show. Catherine, thanks so much for joining us. But first of all, we heard a little bit there about how the economics of spurred by the Industrial Revolution led Europe to turn towards Africa. Was there anything in it for Africa?
Thank you very much. I find the question puzzling. It's a puzzling question because it's a very political question. Myself, being here talking to you about colonialism is a product of that colonial encounter. I'm hardly going to shoot myself in the foot and say it was all bad. However, while one can wax lyrical about the benefits of language and culture that the colonial enterprise brought forth, I think globally, over and above everything else, it was very problematic. It is part of our history. It's part of the history of the African continent. And sometimes I get frustrated by the fact that we believe it's almost as if the history of Africa started there, and it didn't. So that's a mixed response to that very problematic question, but I hope an answer nonetheless.
Thanks very much, Doctor. We'll be hearing from you a little bit later on for a more in-depth examination of your take on the impact that colonialism has had on the continent. But for now, we're going to go back to who got what. Britain and France won big in the scramble for Africa. France controlled most of North Africa as well as large parts of West and Central Africa. Britain helped itself to Egypt, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and the Gold Coast, known as Ghana today. Belgium, Portugal, Spain, Germany, and Italy also took territory. Now, Africans didn't just give in. Many wars were fought, but the machine gun, a product of the Industrial Revolution, gave European colonizers an insurmountable upper hand. The gunboat diplomacy led to indigenous societies being fragmented and put to work. The violent subjugation of Africans by European settlers led to stark racial inequalities that continue to this day. Our correspondents report from South Africa.
Louis Botha, the first Prime Minister of the Union of South Africa, is for some a hero of the Second Boer War.
Water must fall! Water must fall! All colonial symbols must fall!
For others, he's a symbol of colonial oppression.
Black people of this country will take them down with our very own bare hands.
Kulu's organisation has long objected to statues like these. Divisive memorials are dotted throughout South Africa's parliamentary capital. Among them, Jan van Riebeck, one of the first Dutch colonialists to arrive in Cape Town.
That's Maria, and right here is Jan, and that is wife and husband, you know. And in South Africa right now, we don't have that privilege of, unit families because of colonialism, because of apartheid. Families were broken apart with the migrant labor system. I don't only get that feeling of sadness that they broke down our families, I also get a feeling of anger.
Students at the University of Cape Town started the Rhodes Must Fall movement in 2015. The statue of imperialist Cecil Rhodes was removed from campus later that year. The victory inspired similar movements across the world and changes within the university.
It was a remarkable moment, and one that has had ripple effects through the administration of this university, but across the country. We have now many different panels talking about how can we transform not just our spaces, but our ideological spaces, our curricula, who teaches.
The South African government has been criticised for being slow to remove the symbols of apartheid. The Long March to Freedom features 100 bronze statues of liberation heroes from the 1600s through to 1994, demonstrating an alternative engagement with the past. It was the brainchild of Dali Tambo, son of the first ANC president, Oliver Tambo.
The only way to progress as humanity is to heed the voices of this young generation who are saying enough is enough. But now what will you give them? apart from legislation and policies. Give us heritage. Let them swim in the waters of human rights heritage, of anti-racist heritage. We all have histories that shame us on one side, but glorify us on the other side.
For Tambo, historical wrongs can't be undone by destroying statues, but works like his help build a more inclusive national narrative.
So we're going to be joined again by Dr. Nwajiaku Dahu. So, Doctor, you're a British Nigerian, so you've got a particular perspective on that particular colonial relationship. How has Britain's colonial strategy in Nigeria affected the developmental differences that we see between different regions in the country today?
Thank you very much. I think it's important when we speak about colonialism to be very clear that there were different kinds. And even though we had one country, Britain, in Nigeria, the way in which they administered what became a colony was very different in North, in the South, in the East, and in the West. And in fact, long before the official colonization of Nigeria by the British, there was the Lagos Crown Colony, and then subsequently there was the territories of the North that were colonized. And then towards the South and the East, there was a different colonial path. And in fact, the part of Nigeria I'm from, the East, Anambra State, we were one of the last peoples to actually receive the colonial onslaught. And in fact, in many ways, we kind of scrambled at that time to get the best out of it, and in terms of education and so on. And I would just say that, you know, there was a process called indirect rule, which typically describes the manner in which the colonials administered their territory. So working through local leaders that they created. But it was very clear that in the North, whilst there was administration through local rulers or the creation of such, there was also restrictions on missionary activity. I'm talking about Christian missionaries in particular. And this wasn't the case in the South, which meant that the South, the West in particular, and the East and other parts of the South had access to missionary education, which meant access to the colonial language, which meant, finally, when the colonial administration started opening up to Africans, access to becoming part of the colonial administration. And that had profound effects in terms of development. I'm talking about economic and social development, which accompanied mastery of that language. So the big disparities you see in terms of development goods in the North and South are actually part of that colonial pattern.
Now, within the UK and Nigeria itself, do you think that the realities of that colonial relationship is taught in schools, and if not, what needs to change in regard to that?
Well, interesting question. I mean, I think it's a very live question right now. While I was growing up in the UK, it was very unheard of even to speak about the colonial project. I'm very surprised. I currently live in France, and I'm surprised when my 11-year-old daughter comes back and talks about the colonial project as part of her history classes. And then it opens up a whole path for discussion between ourselves about what that was about. When I was growing up, there was nothing of the sort. And I was actually very embarrassed about any mention of anything colonial because all eyes were on me, but I had no tools. I'm talking about educational tools to deal with it. And what does that mean? That also means that you become almost ashamed of that colonial, or you become ashamed of a past which is different to what the norm taught in school. So I think it's a very important moment. We need to reassess the whole curriculum, and I'd be very in favour of using the education system to start to address some of those inadequacies, have profound effects on psyche, on feelings of belonging, and of rage that develops amongst those who don't feel represented and distance as a result from the educational system.
Earlier, you were talking about the specific way that colonialism, that imperialism was implemented on territories. Most of the continent was carved up between Britain and France. Was there much of a difference in the way that those two specific colonial powers managed their African territories?
Yes and no. So the archetypical divide is between the British on the one side, which were very into what I described as indirect rule. So they used intermediaries where there existed to rule through them, right? In the French territories, it was more a direct rule. So rather than building up the capacities of intermediaries or working through intermediaries, it was just the French. But everything depended on what the colonial powers found when they arrived, and also the existence of settler and non-settler colonialism. So in East Africa, in Kenya, in Zimbabwe, you have a very different archetype of colonial rule, which is much more direct. Whereas in West Africa, where the climate did not permit settler colonialism, you have something very different. So there was pragmatism, there was climate. So even in the French territories known for direct rule, there are also examples of indirect rule.
Well, even after independence, former colonies were left embroiled in a battle of identity that included clashes of culture, power, and language. European imperialism set the stage for Cameroon's current brutal Anglophone crisis. Our correspondents report.
The occupancy of this lodge in Boya has tracked Cameroon's complex colonial story. It housed a German governor until 1916, then the British commissioner, and after World War I became the residence of the Prime Minister of Southern Cameroon. The Anglophone British territory joined the independent French-speaking Republic of Cameroon in 1961. Activists like the late Molanjo Litumbe believe that the union should never have happened.
There is no agreement in writing as required by the Constitution of the UN stating that La République has validly joined with Southern Cameroon. What has happened to the country called Southern Cameroon that was granted independence by the World Body of the United Nations effective 1st of October 1961? It has just disappeared.
Today, Anglophone secessionists see the Mongo River as a natural divide between French and English Cameroon. Barrister Felix Agbonkongo spearheaded 2016 protests against the marginalization of English speakers. He says ongoing unrest is a direct result of how the decolonization process was handled between 1961 and 1972.
This is not a struggle between Francophones and Anglophones. It is a struggle between Anglophones who feel marginalized and the institutions of the state. It's a reflection of the bitterness that is existing in Anglophone Cameroon for the time being. People are not satisfied with the government. The government, run by mostly Francophones, they are trying to assimilate us.
What was a cultural and linguistic crisis in October 2016 escalated into conflict from October 2017, with separatists fighting for Anglophone secession. Some Francophone observers claim that insurgents have forgotten a historical desire for post-colonial harmony.
The reunification of Cameroon was wanted by Cameroonians against the will of their colonial masters, who thought that the partition of 1916 was final, as they did in other countries around the world.
60 years after the departure of the French and British, the Anglophone crisis is a direct consequence of Cameroon's twisted colonial history. The violent identity clash has claimed over 3,000 lives and forced more than 500,000 people from their homes.
The idea that the values of colonizers were inherently superior to the values of those colonized was reinforced with violence. The destruction caused by that ideological domination continues to this day. The deeply entrenched idea that colonialism was altruistic has lent itself to the erasure of Belgian atrocities from the Congolese collective memory. Our team reports.
It's a dark and under-examined chapter in Congolese history. In 1885, the country became the personal property of Belgian King Leopold II, who made a fortune from the harvest of a much-prized resource, rubber.
Each village had a quota to meet. If you didn't meet the quota, you were punished. How? They'd cut off your arm.
A barbaric practice which historians say claimed millions of victims, yet has long remained forgotten. That's because when the Congo became a Belgian colony in 1908, Leopold ordered the burning of all state archives. To this day, few historians have written about that period.
The history of a nation must not be concealed. The history of a nation must be passed on from generation to generation. Our children, our grandchildren must learn that history.
That history is largely absent from school curricula in the DRC. Textbooks make hardly any mention of the crimes committed under Leopold II, nor of the system of forced labour implemented by the Belgians.
The place given to colonial crimes in the national curriculum is extremely limited. There should be an effort to dig deeper, develop new materials, and ultimately change the national curriculum.
The legacy of colonial rule is not only absent from textbooks, it's left few visible traces.
This monument was dedicated to King Albert. There was a statue right in front of it, mounted on steel rods, which you can see right there.
Statues of colonial rulers in the DRC were toppled after independence in 1960, but some people say they should be reinstated. This politician believes that breaking from Congo's past like this has obscured understanding of the lasting impact of colonialism.
You can't replace history with nothing. The statues were removed. But then what happened? We've been colonized, we must accept it and we must try to live with it.
Some statues are now on display at the National Museum in Kinshasa. Meanwhile, insecurity, economic exploitation and political instability continue to weigh on the nation's progress.
Well, that's it for our colonialism special. I'd like to thank Dr. Catherine Nwajaku Dahu for joining me in examining some of the enduring effects of European imperialism on Africa. Thanks also to you for joining us. Do so again if you can. Till then, take care.